The stagecoach rattled into Calico Bluff, New Mexico territory, on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883, kicking up a cloud of red dust that hung in the still air like a warning, and the woman who stepped out of it carried herself the way a person does when they have been running long enough that the running has become the only life they know. Her name was Edith Hawthorne, and she was 26 years old, and she had a carpetbag in one hand, and a secret pressed so deep into her chest that some mornings she woke up and could barely breathe for the weight of it. Calico Bluff was not a large town. It had a general store, a blacksmith, a land office that doubled as a post office, a saloon called the Red Lantern, a small whitewashed church at the eastern end of Main Street, and a livery stable that smelled exactly the way you would expect a livery stable in New Mexico territory to smell. It had 340 souls, give or take, and most of them had opinions about strangers. Edith stood in the street and looked at all of it and told herself it would do. She had chosen Calico Bluff the way a drowning person chooses a piece of driftwood, not because it was perfect, but because it was there. She had seen the advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper 6 weeks earlier, tucked between a notice for patent medicine and a call for ranch hands. It had read, "Wanted, a woman of good character and some schooling to serve as schoolteacher in Calico Bluff, New Mexico territory. Wages modest but fair. Room provided. Apply by letter to the Calico Bluff Town Council, care of Postmaster Elias Crane." She had written the letter and gotten the position and packed everything she owned into one carpetbag and boarded a train and then a stagecoach and come west. And she had not told a single soul in St. Louis where she was going, because the man she was running from would have come after her if she had. She straightened her hat, which the journey had knocked slightly sideways, and she walked toward the general store because it seemed like the kind of place where a person could ask a basic question without being stared at too hard. She was wrong about that. The general store belonged to a man named Herbert Peck, who was 52, and had the kind of face that looked like it had been left out in the sun too long and developed an opinion about everything. He looked at Edith over a barrel of dried beans and asked her who she was and where she was from and what she wanted, all in one breath. And Edith answered him in a calm and measured voice that she had been practicing since Kansas City. "My name is Edith Hawthorne. I am the new school teacher. I was told to speak with a Mr. Elias Crane about my accommodations." Herbert Peck looked her over once more, the way men did, cataloging her brown hair and her gray eyes and her traveling dress, which was decent but not fashionable, and then he pointed toward the back of the store. "Elias is at the land office. Through that alley and left. You will know it because the sign is crooked." She thanked him and walked out, and behind her she could hear him already saying something to his wife in a low voice that she was not meant to hear but could hear perfectly well. The land office sign was indeed crooked. Elias Crane was a kind-faced man of about 50 who shook her hand with genuine warmth and showed her the room she had been promised, which was above the post office, and had a window that looked out over the street and a narrow bed and a washstand and a hook on the wall for her coat. It was small and clean, and Edith looked at it and felt something in her shoulders come down by about half an inch. "School starts Monday," Elias told her. "You have got 15 students, ages 6 through 14. The schoolhouse is on the north end of town. I will show you tomorrow if you like. Tonight, you are welcome to take supper at the Red Lantern. They do a good meal despite the name." Edith thanked him and shut the door of her room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and closed her eyes and let herself feel the full weight of where she was and what she had done. She had come to the end of the world to escape a man named Clifton Price, who was not her husband but who had told everyone in St. Louis that she was his, and who had a temper that moved like a flash flood, fast and total and leaving wreckage behind. She had worked in Clifton's household for 4 years, first as a governess to his children and then, gradually, as something more complicated and more trapped. She had not come to that situation willingly. She had come to it the way most women in 1883 came to difficult situations, by being given very few choices and then having the choices made worse over time. The secret she carried was this. Edith Hawthorne had a son. His name was Thomas, and he was 4 years old, and he was not with her. He was in Abilene, Kansas, staying with Edith's older sister Clara and Clara's husband, a decent railroad clerk named George Marsh. Edith had sent Thomas ahead of her 2 months ago, wrapped in a wool blanket and a promise that she would come for him as soon as she had a place that was safe. Clifton Price did not know about Thomas. Clifton had never known about Thomas because Edith had managed to keep the boy hidden from him with a thoroughness that had required every ounce of cleverness she possessed, and the help of Clara, and a great deal of luck that she no longer trusted. She had to build something here first. A room, a job, a life that had enough floor space for a 4-year-old boy to run across, and then she would send for him. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and breathed. Outside the window, Calico Bluff went on about its afternoon. The red lantern was louder than Edith had expected, but not unpleasant. The woman who ran the kitchen was called Me, and she had the arms of a person who had been kneading bread dough for 30 years, and the disposition of someone who did not have time for nonsense. She set a plate of beef stew and cornbread in front of Edith without ceremony, and told her the coffee was on the house for new arrivals. And Edith ate with the focused gratitude of a person who has been living on stagecoach provisions for 3 days. She was halfway through her stew when the door opened, and a man came in. He was tall, which she noticed first, and he moved the way certain men move when they have spent their whole lives outdoors, easy and deliberate, and with a quality of stillness even in motion. He wore a plain canvas coat, and a hat with a dent in the crown that suggested it had been sat on at some point and not particularly mourned. He had dark hair and a jaw that had not seen a razor in perhaps 4 days, and eyes that were, she would later determine, the precise color of creek water in late afternoon. He nodded at the bartender, whose name was Pete, and Pete nodded back and poured something without being asked, and the man sat down at the bar with the ease of someone who had sat in that exact spot 100 times. Edith returned to her stew. She did not need to look at anyone. She especially did not need to look at tall men who moved with that particular kind of ease, because, in her experience, that kind of ease often concealed something that would eventually make your life harder. Me came out of the kitchen to refill Edith's coffee and leaned against the counter in the way of a woman who has decided to be friendly whether you want her to or not. "You the new school teacher?" Me asked. "I am," Edith said. "Good. Those children need someone who will make them sit still. The last one lasted 4 months before he decided mining looked easier." Me jerked her chin toward the bar. "That's Jasper Donnelly. He owns the Double D Ranch about 8 miles north. He comes in on Tuesdays for supplies and supper." Edith did not look at Jasper Donnelly. "Is that so?" "He's a good man," Me said, with the particular emphasis women use when they mean, "and unattached, and you might want to consider it." "I appreciate the information," Edith said pleasantly, and finished her cornbread. She walked back to her room above the post office and lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Thomas, who would have been asleep by now in Abilene, and whether Clara was reading to him the way Edith had asked, and whether he was asking for her the way he had been when she left, standing at Clara's gate with his small, serious face turned up to hers and saying, "You are coming back," not as a question, but as a statement that required confirmation. "I am coming back," she had told him. "I am going ahead to make things ready." "That is what soldiers do," Thomas had said, because he had been listening to George Marsh's stories. "Yes," Edith had said. "That is exactly what I am doing." She was still thinking about his face when she fell asleep. The schoolhouse was a single room with 8 rows of benches and a blackboard that had been written on so many times the chalk barely showed. Edith spent Saturday and Sunday cleaning it and organizing the small collection of books that had been donated by various townspeople over the years. A King James Bible, 2 arithmetic primers, a well-worn McGuffey reader, a geography book missing its cover, and inexplicably, a French grammar that she suspected no one had ever opened. On Monday morning, 15 children arrived, ranging from a solemn 6-year-old girl named Millie to a 14-year-old boy named Patrick who sat in the back and radiated the aggressive indifference of someone who had already decided he knew everything. Edith stood at the front of the room and looked at all of them and felt something she had not expected to feel: useful. She was a good teacher. She had known this instant. Louis, when she had managed Clifton Price's children with a combination of patience and genuine interest in what they were learning. But there was something different about teaching children who actually needed what she could give them. Children in a territory town, where the nearest library was 100 miles away, and the nearest university was farther than most of them could imagine. By the end of the first week, even Patrick had stopped pretending he didn't find the geography book interesting. She settled into a routine: school in the mornings and early afternoons. Supper at the Red Lantern most evenings because it was easier than cooking in her small room, though me had let her use the kitchen twice, and she had made herself a simple pot of beans and salt pork that had tasted like civilization. She saw Jasper Donnelly on the following Tuesday. He was loading supplies into a wagon outside Herbert Peck's store, which meant she walked past him on her way back from the schoolhouse. He looked up when she passed and touched the brim of his hat in the easy, automatic way of a man raised to acknowledge women, and she nodded back and kept walking. On the Tuesday after that, he was eating supper at the Red Lantern when she came in, and me, who was not subtle, put Edith's plate down at the table nearest his and said something about how the other tables needed wiping. Edith sat down. Jasper Donnelly looked over at her with those creekwater eyes and said, "You are the new school teacher." "Yes," she said. "Jasper Donnelly," he said, and did not extend his hand across the space between them because the tables were not that close, but the introduction had the quality of an offered hand. "Edith Hawthorne," she said. "How are the children?" he asked, and the question surprised her because it was genuine, not conversational filler. 15 strong and most of them willing, she said. The 14-year-old in the back row has started reading ahead in the geography book when he thinks I am not watching. Something moved in Jasper Donnelly's expression. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one. "That would be Patrick Hale," he said. "His father has been trying to get him interested in cattle since he could walk. I think the boy wants to be somewhere that is not here." "Most people of 14 want to be somewhere that is not where they are," Edith said. He looked at her for a moment in a way that made her want to pick up her fork and direct her attention firmly at her stew. "That is true," he said. "Though some of them grow out of it." She ate her supper and they spoke occasionally, not in a sustained way but in the way of two people at adjacent tables who have determined that conversation is not unpleasant. He told her he had been running the Double D for 6 years, that he had come to New Mexico from Colorado, that he ran about 400 head of cattle and employed 3 cowhands. She told him she had come from St. Louis and that the West was different than she had expected. "In what way?" he asked. "Larger," she said, "and quieter than the large I had expected." He nodded. "It gets inside you, the quiet. Either you hate it or after a while it is the only thing that feels true." She thought about that for the rest of the evening. The letter from Clara came in the second week of May, and Edith stood at the post office window with it in her hands and her heart in her throat and tore it open with fingers that were not entirely steady. Clara wrote clearly and practically, which was why Edith loved her. Thomas was well. He had made a friend on Clara's street, a boy named Henry who was also 4, and they spent their afternoons digging in Clara's garden and presenting the earthworms they found to George as though they were treasure. He was asking for his mother every morning and every night, and Clara was telling him that she was coming. But at the bottom of the letter, Clara's handwriting changed, became smaller and more careful, and Edith read, "I do not want to alarm you, but Clifton Price came to the house last week. He did not know Thomas was here, I am certain of it. He was asking for you. I told him I had not heard from you in months. He believed me, I think. But Edith, he looked angry in that particular way that worried me, and George thinks you should know. Edith folded the letter into her apron pocket and stood outside the post office in the bright May sun and made herself breathe. He was looking. She had known he would be looking. She just needed more time. She needed to make this life real enough to hold Thomas, and she needed to be certain Clifton could not follow her trail here, and she needed to stop her hands from shaking. She went back to the schoolhouse and taught long division and did not let the fear show on her face. That Tuesday, at the Red Lantern, Jasper Donnelly was already at his usual place at the bar when Edith came in, and me, with her characteristic bluntness, had managed to arrange things so that there was really only one open table, and it was the one nearest the bar. Edith sat down and me disappeared into the kitchen, and Jasper turned on his stool and said, "You all right?" Edith looked up from the menu she had already memorized. "Pardon. You look like you are carrying something heavier than usual," he said, not unkindly. As a statement of fact, the way a man who watches weather patterns notices a different kind of cloud. She considered lying. She was very good at lying in the refined way of a woman who has had to protect herself by managing what other people knew. But something about the directness of his question, the absence of any guile in it, made her pause. "I received a letter today," she said, "from my sister. Bad news, complicated news," she said. He nodded and turned back to his drink and did not ask anything further, which was exactly the right thing to do, and somehow the fact that he did not push made her want to say more. "My sister is caring for someone," Edith said carefully. "Someone I am responsible for, and I received word that a difficulty I had hoped was behind me has not entirely resolved itself." Jasper Donnelly was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If there is anything I can do, I am willing." "You do not know me," Edith said. "No," he agreed. "But you have been teaching my neighbor's children to think, which counts for something in my book." She almost smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Donnelly." "Jasper," he said. "Jasper," she repeated, and the word was ordinary, and yet for some reason it felt like a small step across uncertain ground. June came in with heat that pressed down on Calico Bluff like a hand. Edith threw open both windows of the schoolhouse and taught with her sleeves rolled up and her students fanning themselves with their readers. And by July the school recessed for summer, and she found herself with long empty afternoons that she filled with writing detailed letters to Clara and to Thomas, whom Clara read to aloud, and with walking the town until she knew every inch of it. She began to know the rhythms of Calico Bluff. She knew that the blacksmith, a man named Luther Kane, was up before dawn, and that the sound of his hammer was as reliable as a clock. She knew that Herbert Peck's wife, Agnes, ran a small lending library from the back of the general store, and was glad of a conversation partner who did not want to discuss livestock prices. She knew that Elias Crane had a daughter in Santa Fe who sent him letters that he read 3 or 4 times before folding them back into their envelopes. She knew that Jasper Donnelly came into town on Tuesdays but occasionally also on Thursdays, and that on those Thursday visits he sometimes brought one of his cowhands with him, a young man named Eli who was 22, and had the permanently sunburned look of someone who had decided hats were more trouble than they were worth. She was at Agnes Peck's lending library one afternoon when Jasper came in, which surprised her because he did not seem like a man who frequented lending libraries. He stood in the doorway looking slightly out of place among the bookshelves, and Agnes beamed at him with the particular delight women beam at a man who enters a library willingly. "Jasper," Agnes said. "What can I find for you?" "Something on surveying," he said. "I have a boundary dispute with a neighbor and I would like to understand the technical language before I speak to the county man." Agnes went to rummage in the back, and Jasper stood near the door, and Edith looked up from the biography of President Lincoln she had been reading. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, touching his hat brim. "A boundary dispute," she said. "Walter Greer says the east fence of my pasture is 6 feet into his land." Jasper's voice was level, but she could hear the tension underneath it. "I do not believe that is true, and I intend to prove it." "Is Walter Greer a difficult man?" Walter Greer is the kind of man who makes things difficult for sport, Jasper said. He has been trying to chip away at the Double D since I arrived because he does not believe I should have gotten the land I did. He had his eye on it. That seems unjust, Edith said. Most things Greer does are unjust, Jasper said, and then he seemed to decide he had said enough on the subject and asked her what she was reading. She showed him the spine of the book. He nodded slowly. Lincoln, he said. My father used to say Lincoln was the best and worst thing that ever happened to this country, and he would not elaborate further. What do you think? Edith asked. Jasper was quiet for a moment. I think some things are better now, and some things are worse, and most things are complicated, he said. Same as always. Agnes returned with a surveying manual, and Jasper paid her with careful coin and left. And Edith watched him go and then looked back at her book and found she had to reread the paragraph she had been on 3 times before it stuck. It was in July, on a hot, breathless afternoon, that she told him about Thomas. She had not intended to. She had been careful about everything, and the secret had become so much a part of how she held herself that she could barely imagine setting it down. But she had walked past the Double D's south fence on one of her long afternoon walks, which she took further and further out of town as the summer deepened, and she had found Jasper on the other side of it, mending a section that had come loose, and they had fallen into the easy conversation they had developed over the past 2 months. He had asked about her family in the way of someone making conversation, not prying but present, and she had said something about her sister Clara in Abilene, and he had asked if she missed her, and she had said yes, and then without quite deciding she had said, "My son is with her." The words sat in the air between them. Jasper set down the wire he was holding and looked at her. She had braced herself. She had gotten very good at reading the particular sequence of calculations that happened on a man's face when he learned that she had a child, the reassessment, the slight cooling, the repositioning of whatever feeling he might have been developing. She had seen it happen enough times that she had stopped telling people. Jasper's face did not do any of those things. He looked at her with those creek-water eyes and he said, "How old?" 4, she said. "Nearly 5 in September," he nodded. "What is his name?" "Thomas." Something in his expression gentled. "You miss him." It was not a question. She felt her throat close slightly. "Every day," she said. "I came here to build something first, a position, a room, a life that could hold him safely." "Why could it not hold him in St. Louis?" Jasper asked, and his voice was careful, the voice of someone who knows they are touching something tender and is doing it with attention. She looked at the red dirt under her boots. She looked at the fence post he had been repairing. She looked at the long, flat distance of the territory, and she said, "There was a man who believed he had a claim on me. He did not have one, but he was the kind of man who is not interested in that distinction." Silence. "He does not know about Thomas," she added. "I kept Thomas hidden from him for nearly 4 years. That is why I could not bring Thomas with me. Too easy to follow a woman with a small child. I needed to come first and make sure the trail was cold." Jasper picked up his wire again. He turned it in his hands once slowly, and then he said, "Is there still danger? My sister wrote in May that he came to her house asking about me. She told him she did not know where I was." Edith kept her voice steady. "I do not think he found anything. But I have not stopped watching." Jasper was quiet for a long moment. A hawk moved in a slow circle above them, cutting against the blue. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, and his voice was quiet and serious in the way she had come to understand meant he was being wholly direct. "What I am about to say is not meant to overstep, and you are free to tell me it is none of my business, but if that man ever comes to Calico Bluff, I would like to know about it, before it becomes a problem." She looked at him. "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because some things should not go unanswered," he said simply, "and because you are one of us now. Calico Bluff is not a large town, but it is a community, and in a community people look out for each other." She did not know what to say to that, so she said the only thing she could say, which was, "Thank you, Jasper." He went back to his fence and she went back to her walk, and her heart was doing something complicated that she did not examine too closely. She wrote to Clara that evening. She said she thought Calico Bluff might be ready for Thomas by September. if the school year starting went well and she managed to negotiate a small pay increase with the town council. She said she had found some people she was beginning to trust, which she knew Clara would read as significant because Edith did not say such things lightly. She did not say anything specific about Jasper Donnelly, but she had a feeling Clara would ask about whatever she was not saying. The boundary dispute resolved in August when a county surveyor came out from Santa Fe and confirmed that Walter Greer's claim was wrong, that the Double D's east fence was placed correctly and had been for 6 years. Walter Greer stood in the road outside the land office and said things about Jasper that made Agnes Peck, who was passing, put her hand over her heart in affront. Jasper stood there and let him say them, which Edith thought was either remarkable self-control or the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you were right. She passed Jasper on the street afterward and said, "I heard the surveyor found in your favor." "He did," Jasper said. There was no triumph in his voice, only a kind of tired relief. "And Greer will find another way to make trouble," Jasper said. "Men like that always do, but the fence is mine and that is what matters today." They walked together toward the Red Lantern, which had become, over the summer, something like a habit, both of them arriving around suppertime on various evenings, and finding the other there without having exactly arranged it. Me watched this with the calm satisfaction of a woman who had predicted it in April and was not surprised to be right. Over supper, Jasper asked about Thomas's birthday coming in September, and whether Edith was planning to go to Abilene or bring him to Calico Bluff, and she explained her thinking, that she was waiting for one more paycheck and wanted to be sure the schoolroom arrangements would allow her to have Thomas nearby during school hours. "There is a woman on the east side of town," Jasper said. "Name of Ruth Benson. She minds children while their parents work. She cared for the Alvarez children when their mother was ill last winter. She is good." "How do you know these things?" Edith asked, genuinely curious. He tilted his head slightly. "Calico Bluff is 300 people," he said. "You pay attention." She had begun to understand that about him. Jasper Donnelly was quiet in a way that was not indifference. It was observation. He noticed things. The crack in the schoolhouse step she had not gotten around to mentioning, which he had fixed one morning without being asked, leaving only a neat set of new boards and no note. The afternoon she had looked pale and tired, and he had flagged me down and quietly arranged that her supper came with the good bread rather than the ordinary, which cost extra. The way he remembered things people said and brought them back weeks later in ways that showed he had been thinking about them. She was falling in love with him, she realized on an evening in late August, sitting on the step outside the post office with the night coming down in layers of violet and rust over the desert, and the recognition was quiet and alarming and somehow, despite everything, not entirely unwelcome. She had not thought she was capable of it anymore. She had spent 4 years in Clifton Price's orbit having the belief in love systematically removed, and she had assumed that the removal was permanent, the way you assume a burned field can never grow anything again. But the territory had its own rules about what grew in unlikely places. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she had a child to send for and a life to build and no business feeling anything about a rancher who came to town on Tuesdays and occasionally fixed steps without being asked. She wrote to Clara and said, "Thomas can come in October. I have arranged everything." Clara wrote back, "He has been packed since July. Also, who is Jasper?" Edith had not mentioned Jasper's name anywhere in her letters. She wrote back, "I have no idea what you are talking about." Clara's reply arrived in 3 days, which was unusually fast, and contained nothing but the words, "Of course you do not." September brought the school year back and 15 students who had spent the summer growing in the way children do when you are not watching. Patrick Hale, now almost as tall as Edith, and pretending he had not spent the summer reading the geography book he had borrowed from Agnes Peck's lending library. Edith had come in to find a fourth reader on her desk that had not been there before school, along with a note in careful handwriting that said, "I read that the Mississippi River is 2,340 miles long. Patrick." She held the note for a moment and then pinned it to the wall above her desk. The town had begun to accept her in the gradual way of small communities, which is to say that people stopped treating her arrival as news and started treating her as a fact. Agnes Peck invited her to the quilting circle that met on Wednesday afternoons in the back of the general store. The minister's wife, a brisk woman named Ellen Forsyth, asked her to help organize the harvest social in October. Ruth Benson, when Edith met her, was a broad-shouldered woman of about 50 with rough, kind hands who said yes. She would be glad to mind a 4-year-old boy on weekday mornings. And what was his name? Thomas, Edith said, and felt the name settle around her like something she had been holding at arm's length finally coming home. She wrote the letter to Clara. Thomas could come on the stage from Abilene to Santa Fe, and then the connecting line to Calico Bluff, with Clara or George escorting him as far as Santa Fe. George had business there in late October anyway, Clara wrote. George would put Thomas on the stage himself and Edith could meet it. The last piece of the architecture she had been building since March was almost in place. It was on a warm September evening, one of those evenings the desert makes in early fall when the air has just enough cool in it to be a promise but the ground is still summer warm, that Jasper came to find her, not at the Red Lantern. He came to the post office, which was where she had been sitting on the step with a book in the early evening, and he came with his hat in his hands in the way of a man who has decided to say something and is committing to it. She looked up at him. "Miss Hawthorne," he said. Edith. The use of her given name was not frequent between them. It had the weight of something deliberate. She closed her book. "Jasper," she said, "what is the matter?" He sat down on the step beside her, which was close enough that she could see the particular fine lines at the corners of his eyes that came from years of squinting across bright distances, and he turned his hat in his hands once and said, "I have been trying to figure out how to say this for about 2 months. Her heart did something it had no business doing. There is no requirement that you say anything," she said, to give him room. "I know that," he said. "That is not why I came." He looked out across the street where the last of the evening light was doing what evening light does in New Mexico, which is turn every ordinary surface into something that looks like it was painted by someone who loves the world. "I came because I wanted to be honest with you, and because I think you deserve honesty more than most people I have met." She waited. "I think you are remarkable," he said plainly. "I have thought so since that first evening at the Red Lantern when you told me you had found the territory quieter than you expected. I have thought it every Tuesday and Thursday since, and I have thought it about 500 other times when you were not anywhere near me." He stopped turning his hat. "And I am aware that you have a life you are building, and a son you are bringing here, and enough on your mind without me adding to it. So I am not asking you for anything. I just wanted you to know what I am thinking, because I suspect I am not particularly hidden, and it seemed better to say it than to let it sit there between us unspoken." Edith looked at him for a long time. "You are right that you are not particularly hidden," she said at last, and her voice was careful and honest. "I have known for some weeks. I have been trying to decide what to do about it." He met her eyes. "What conclusion did you reach?" "That I am not finished being afraid," she said. "That I have a history that is not simple and a child who must come first in all things, and that I do not know whether I can be what someone would want." "I am not asking you to be anything," Jasper said quietly. "I am only telling you the truth." She looked at her hands. "Clifton Price is still out there," she said, "somewhere, looking possibly. I know. And Thomas is coming in October. He is almost 5 and he is serious, and he asks a great many questions, and he will require a great deal of attention." "I imagine he will," Jasper said, and there was something in his voice that was warm rather than resigned. "And I came here carrying more than I have told most people," she said. "Jasper, there is more to this than what I have said." "Then sit down with me," he said, "and tell me all of it." The invitation was so simple that it knocked the breath out of her. She looked at him and saw that he meant it, that he was not bracing for a performance, not calculating the distance between what she might say and some limit of his patience. He was just sitting there on the post office step in the September evening with his hat in his hands, asking her to tell him the truth. So she did. She told him everything. She told him about working in Clifton Price's house in St. Louis as a governess in 1879, when she was 22, and had needed the work after her father died and left her and Clara with barely enough to bury him on. She told him that Clifton Price was a widower with money and influence, and a way of making a woman feel that she owed him something, that the good wages and the roof over her head were not simply employment but obligation. She told him that she had fought it for 2 years and lost in a way that she did not speak of plainly, but that Jasper heard and understood from what she did not say, and that she had found out about Thomas in 1878 and hidden the pregnancy with Clara's help, and had the boy at Clara's house in Abilene rather than in St. Louis, telling Clifton she had gone to care for a sick relative. She told him that she had loved Thomas from the first moment, and that he had made everything both harder and clearer, the way important things do. She told him that Clifton had grown more controlling over the 3 years after, that she had been planning her escape for 18 months before she executed it, that she had been very careful and very methodical because she had learned the hard way that careless plans had consequences. She told him about the advertisement in the newspaper and the letter to Elias Crane and the train and the stagecoach and the red dust of Calico Bluff rising up around her feet when she stepped off it, and how it had looked like the end of the world and she had told herself it would do. She told him that she was afraid still on certain mornings, that the trail was not cold enough, that Clifton Price's anger was the kind that did not run out. Jasper listened to all of it. He did not interrupt her and he did not look away, and when she finally stopped talking, the night had fully come down around them and the stars over New Mexico were doing what New Mexico stars do, which is illuminate the darkness so thoroughly that it stops feeling like absence. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me." She let out a breath she had been holding for some time. "Most people," she said, "when they hear a story like that, they begin to recalculate." "Most people," he agreed, "have not been paying attention." He looked up at the stars. "I was married once, 7 years ago. Her name was Cecilia. She died of fever in Colorado in our 2nd year of marriage. I will not say that that is anything like what you have been through, because it is not, but I will say that it taught me something about how a person carries grief and keeps moving, about how the carrying does not make you less, it makes you more careful about what matters." She had not known about Cecilia. It sat in her chest with the weight of something important. "I am sorry," she said. "So am I," he said simply. "But life went on, it does." They sat in the dark for a while longer, not speaking, and somewhere down the street someone was playing a fiddle in the red lantern, faint and reedy in the night air, and the stars were extraordinary. "I am not asking you to decide anything tonight," Jasper said at last. "I only wanted you to know that what you told me does not change the truth of who you are. And the truth of who you are is someone I have a great deal of respect and regard for. And if Clifton Price follows the trail here," she said, "then we will deal with that," he said, "together if you will allow it." She looked at him. In the dark, his face was steady and unhurried, and she thought, not for the first time, that steadiness in a person was not the same thing as dullness. Some things were steady the way the earth is steady, because they have that much beneath them. "I would allow it," she said. The Harvest Social in October was Edith's project almost as much as Ellen Forsythe's, and she threw herself into organizing it with the energy of a woman who has found that keeping her hands busy keeps her thoughts from spiraling. She made lists and spoke to me about food and helped string lanterns in the space behind the church, and managed to convince Herbert Peck to donate 3 barrels of apple cider, which took almost as much negotiating skill as the land office contract had. She was hanging the last of the lanterns when the stage came in. She heard it before she saw it, the rattle and percussion of it on the hard-packed road, and she climbed down from the chair she had been standing on and walked quickly toward Main Street with her heart doing things that were not ladylike or composed. The stage stopped and the door opened, and the first thing she saw were two small boots, very serious and very dusty, and then the rest of Thomas came out, who was almost 5 and had apparently grown 2 inches since she had last seen him, and he saw her and his face did the thing that children's faces do when they see the person they belong to. A total unguarded explosion of relief and joy that had nothing practiced in it. She went down on her knees in the red dust of Calico Bluff's Main Street and held him. He pressed his face into her shoulder and said nothing for a long time. She could feel his heart against her chest, fast and small and real. "I told you I was coming back," she said into his hair. "You took a long time," he said, which was fair. "I know," she said. "I am sorry. Are you all right?" He pulled back and examined her with the grave thoroughness of a person conducting an inspection. "You look thinner," he said. "I have been eating at a saloon," she said. He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Is there a horse?" "There are many horses," she said. "This entire town is full of horses. Come on. Let me show you where we live." George Marsh had come only as far as Santa Fe, as planned, and the stagecoach driver, a weathered man named Bill, had kept an eye on Thomas with the practiced unconcern of someone who had been transporting small, unaccompanied persons since the mail routes opened. Edith thanked him and tipped him generously and took Thomas's hand and walked him up the steps to the room above the post office. Thomas stood in the middle of the room and looked at the narrow bed and the washstand and the window. "It is small," he said. "Yes," Edith agreed, "but it is ours." "It is ours," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and went to look out the window. Jasper met Thomas 3 days after his arrival, which was sooner than Edith had planned, but not entirely a surprise given that Calico Bluff was small enough that everyone knew a child had arrived, and that the child in question had a habit of appearing wherever things of interest were happening. Thomas had found his way to the street outside the livery stable because there was a horse being shod, and he considered this essential viewing, and Edith had come to collect him and found him standing with his hands on the fence rail watching the process with total concentration. Jasper was there as well, having brought in one of his own horses for the same purpose, and he was standing a few feet from Thomas with his hat pushed back on his head, and he was watching Thomas watch the horse. Edith stopped a few feet away. Jasper looked up at her and something in his face was quiet and warm. Thomas turned around. He regarded Jasper with the thorough assessment he gave everything. "Are you the rancher?" he asked. Jasper looked slightly surprised, but only slightly. "I am." "How did you know that?" "My mother talks about the rancher," Thomas said. "She does not say much, but she talks about him." Edith decided she would address that later. "My name is Jasper Donnelly," Jasper said, and he crouched down slightly so that he and Thomas were closer to the same level, which Edith noted with a particular quality of attention. "What is your name?" "Thomas Hawthorne," Thomas said. "I am nearly 5. "That is a significant age," Jasper said seriously. "I know," Thomas said. "I can read already. My mother taught me. I can read most words. There are some hard ones." "Which ones are hard?" Thomas thought about it. "Geography," he said. "There is a boy at school who reads about geography." "That would be Patrick," Jasper said. "You know Patrick." "I know most people here." Thomas seemed to find this acceptable. He turned back to the horse being shod and pointed. "Why does it not hurt them?" And Jasper, without any sense of performance about it, began to explain calmly and factually how a horse's hoof is structured. And Thomas listened with his small, serious face tilted up. And Edith stood there watching and felt something happen in her chest that was either very complicated or very simple, and she could not decide which. October passed in a blaze of color and preparation. The harvest social came, and was a success that even Herbert Peck admitted grudgingly. And there was music and cider, and Edith danced once with Jasper, who danced the way he did everything else, with a kind of careful attention that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. They did not speak much during it. They did not need to. Thomas had, within 2 weeks of his arrival, made himself at home in Calico Bluff with the territorial confidence of someone who has decided to claim a place. He spent his mornings with Ruth Benson, who had taken to him with the warmth of a woman whose own grandchildren were far away. He spent his afternoons with Edith at the schoolhouse when she had older students who would not be disturbed by a small boy in the corner with a reader. He spent Sunday mornings at church, where he sat with careful posture and occasionally asked questions during the sermon that made Ellen Forsythe look slightly pained. He had also developed an attachment to Jasper that Edith had not entirely anticipated. It had happened gradually, in the way Thomas did things, through consistent attendance and the accumulating weight of small moments. Jasper had, one Thursday, been passing the schoolhouse when Thomas was playing in the yard at the end of the school day, and he had stopped and shown Thomas how to whistle properly, which Thomas had been attempting without success for some time. The next Thursday, Thomas had presented him with a smooth river stone that he said was good luck, and Jasper had accepted it with gravity and put it in his coat pocket, and as far as Edith could tell, kept it there. By November, Thomas called him Jasper without any ceremony, and Jasper responded with the same unhurried ease he gave everyone, which somehow contained more warmth when it was directed at Thomas than Edith could quite describe. She was marking arithmetic papers one evening when she thought, not for the first time and with increasing clarity, she was in love with this man. Not the desperate, tangled thing that had characterized her years in St. Louis, which had never been love but rather a kind of siege from which she had no clear exit. This was different. This was the slow and sure thing, built from Tuesday suppers and fixed porch steps, and a man who crouched down to a child's level without being asked, from honesty given and received on a September step under extraordinary stars. She said nothing to him about it yet. She was still afraid of certain things, and she thought she owed herself the time to sit with the feeling before she spoke it. The letter arrived on a Monday in mid-November, and it was not from Clara. It was from a lawyer in St. Louis, a man named Gerald Hooper, and it was brief and formal and said only that his client, Mr. Clifton Price, had reason to believe she was in the New Mexico territory, and that his client wished to discuss certain matters of a personal nature, and that she should expect his client to be in contact. She read it 3 times. Then she sat very still for a long time. Then she put it in her apron pocket and went to school and taught the full day without letting anything show on her face. And at the end of the school day, when the children had gone home and Thomas was with Ruth Benson, she sat at her desk and let herself feel the full cold weight of it. He had found her. She did not know how. She did not know whether it was the letter Clara had not sent from the right place, or someone who recognized her name, or simply the persistence of a man with money who had hired someone to look. But he had found her. She thought about what Jasper had said in September. Then we will deal with that, together, if you will allow it. She went to find him. He was at the Double D, which was 8 miles out, and she had borrowed the use of a horse from Luther Kane, who asked no questions, and she rode out in the November afternoon with the cold coming down off the mountains in the north, and the red earth going purple in the fading light. She found him in the yard of the ranch house, which was a solid, unpretentious building of adobe and timber that looked like it had been built to last and not to impress. He saw her coming and stood up from what he had been doing, which was repairing a saddle, and he could tell from the quality of her arrival that this was not a social call. She dismounted and handed the letter to him without preamble. He read it. She watched his face. It did what she had learned his face did with difficult information, went very still and very attentive like a man consulting something internal. He folded the letter and handed it back. "When did this come?" "This morning." "Does anyone else know?" "No," she said. "I came to you first." Something in his expression shifted at that briefly and then settled back into focus. "All right," he said. "Come inside." The ranch house was warm, a fire going in the main room, and it smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and something that suggested a pot of beans had been on the stove most of the day. He poured her coffee without asking, and she sat at the table and he sat across from her and they looked at the letter between them. "The lawyer's letter is a test," Jasper said. "He wants to see if you will respond. If you do, he knows you are frightened. If you do not, he comes anyway, but he knows less." "I was not planning to respond," Edith said. "Good." He leaned back in his chair. "He said he has reason to believe you are in the territory. That is vague. He may know Calico Bluff specifically, or he may be casting wide." "I cannot know which," she said. "No," he agreed. "But we can make it harder for him regardless." He thought for a moment. "I want to speak to Elias Crane. As postmaster, he has some authority over what comes and goes here, and I want to talk to Sheriff Dawes." Calico Bluff had a sheriff, a small dusty man named Harold Dawes, who Edith had assumed was largely decorative but who Jasper seemed to think was more useful than he appeared. "What would the sheriff do?" she asked. "He cannot stop a man from entering the territory," Jasper said. "But he can make very clear that the territory has its own laws, and that harassment of a citizen in good standing is not something that will be tolerated." His voice was steady and calm, and she realized that what she had initially thought of as Jasper's quietness was, in fact, a form of clarity. He did not waste anything on panic because he was already moving toward the solution. "And if he comes here himself," she said. "Then we deal with it when it comes," Jasper said. "But Edith, you are not alone in this. I want you to understand that." She looked at him across the table in the firelit room of his ranch house and said, "I am beginning to understand that." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I will ride in tomorrow and speak to Harold. And I would like, with your permission, to tell him what I know so he can make an informed assessment." "You have my permission," she said. She rode back to town in the dark with the stars very large above her and the horse's breath smoking in the cold air, and she thought that the word alone had been so familiar to her for so long that its opposite still surprised her when she encountered it. Jasper spoke to Sheriff Harold Dawes, who was, as it turned out, more than decorative. Harold Dawes had spent 20 years in law before coming to Calico Bluff for reasons he did not elaborate on, and he had a quiet competence that he wore the way Jasper wore his plainness, without announcement. He listened to what Jasper told him, asked 3 precise questions, and then said he would write to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe to have a record of the situation on file, and that if Clifton Price set foot in Calico Bluff with any hostile intent, there would be a framework to address it quickly. He also said something to Edith directly, which was, "Miss Hawthorne, you have done nothing wrong. A man's belief that he has a claim on a woman is not the same as having one. Not in this territory and not in any territory where the law is applied correctly. You understand that?" "Yes," she said. "I understand it. I appreciate hearing it said plainly." "Good," Harold Dawes said, and went back to his desk. December came in cold and bright, the mountains to the north showing snow that glittered on clear mornings when the light came in low and golden, and Calico Bluff prepared for Christmas with the organized enthusiasm of a small town that takes its celebrations seriously. There was to be a pageant at the church on Christmas Eve, which involved most of the schoolchildren and required Edith to manage the allocation of angel costumes with the diplomatic precision of a treaty negotiation. Thomas had very strong opinions about being a shepherd rather than an angel, and she supported this absolutely. She was cutting fabric for shepherd's robes at Agnes Peck's quilting table one Wednesday when Agnes said, with her characteristic lack of preamble, "Jasper Donnelly has not courted anyone since Cecilia." Edith did not look up from her cutting. "I know about Cecilia." He told me," she said. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then, "He is a good man, Edith. I have known him for 6 years and I have never seen him be anything else." "I know that too," Edith said. "Well," Agnes said, with the satisfaction of a woman who has made her point. "Good." Jasper came to the Christmas pageant. He sat in the 3rd row and watched Thomas, who took the role of shepherd with a concentration that suggested he considered it a serious dramatic responsibility, and he did not make any sound during the performance that would have indicated he found any of it charming or affecting. But afterward he sought out Thomas in the crowd and said, "That was well done," with complete seriousness, and Thomas looked at him and nodded once as though this had been the important verdict. After the pageant there was a gathering at the church, cider and cookies and candles, and at some point in the evening Edith found herself standing near the door with Jasper while Thomas had attached himself to Patrick Hale, who was apparently willing to explain geographical features to a 4-year-old for a limited period. "This is a good town," Edith said, watching the room. "It is," Jasper agreed. "When I stepped off the stage in March I told myself it would do," she said. "I was wrong about that." "It does more than do." He looked at her. In the candlelight he looked like something out of a painting, the planes of his face warm and particular. "I am glad you stayed," he said. "Jasper," she said, and her voice had something in it she had decided to let through. "I need to tell you something." He waited. "I am in love with you," she said. It came out cleaner than she had expected, like a thing that had been wanting to be said and was relieved to finally be said. "I have been for some time. I did not want to say it before I was certain, and now I am certain." The room went on around them, cider and candles and children dressed as angels. Jasper looked at her for a long, still moment, and then he said, quietly and with total conviction, "I have been in love with you since September, since the step outside the post office, since you sat there and told me the truth and did not flinch from any of it." She felt warmth move through her from somewhere deep, the kind of warmth that is not temperature but belonging. "What do we do about it?" she said. "Whatever you want to do about it," he said. "At whatever pace feels right to you. I am not in a hurry. I have a ranch and a community and a good reason to stay exactly where I am." She looked up at him. "I would like to not be in quite so much of a hurry to be cautious," she said. "I have been careful for 4 years, and I am tired of being careful in ways that keep me from living." Something in his expression broke open slightly, warm and real. "Then we agree," he said. She put her hand in his, there in the candle-lit room at the Calico Bluff Christmas gathering, and he held it the way he did everything else, with steadiness and attention, and it was the simplest and most complete thing she could remember feeling in years. Thomas, who had apparently been watching from across the room, appeared at Edith's elbow a moment later and looked at their joined hands with the assessment of a nearly 5-year-old who takes data collection seriously. Then he looked up at Jasper. "Are you going to marry my mother?" he asked. Edith made a sound that might have been a word. Jasper looked down at Thomas with great seriousness. "I am considering it," he said. "If that would be all right with you." Thomas thought about it. "You know about horses," he said, "and geography." "I know a reasonable amount about both," Jasper agreed. Thomas appeared to reach a conclusion. "That is acceptable," he said, and went back to Patrick Hale. January brought something Edith had been anticipating and dreading. Clifton Price came to Calico Bluff. He arrived on a Thursday morning on a hired horse from Santa Fe, and he was everything she remembered and worse for the 4 years and the distance and the audacity of it. He was a large man, not tall like Jasper but broad, and carrying himself with the certainty of a man who had rarely been told no in a way that held. He had a dark coat and city boots that were already dusty from the road, and he asked at the general store for Edith Hawthorne with the ease of a man who expects to be answered. Herbert Peck, to his credit, said he did not know who that was. He said it to Edith herself later, with a slightly embarrassed look and an explanation that he had not known what to do and lying had seemed like the best option. "Thank you," Edith said. "You did exactly right." But Clifton had asked elsewhere, and by mid-morning there were 3 people in Calico Bluff who knew that a large man from St. Louis was asking about the school teacher, and one of those people was Jasper Donnelly, who had come in that morning for his Thursday supply run. Edith was at the schoolhouse when Jasper appeared at the door. She looked up and she could tell from the quality of his face that it had happened. "He is here," she said. "He is here," Jasper confirmed. "He is at the Red Lantern asking me questions that me is not answering. Harold Dawes knows." She put down her chalk. Her hands were steady. She was surprised by how steady they were. "What happens now?" she asked. "Harold will speak to him," Jasper said, formally. He has the territorial marshal's letter on file and he can make very clear what the consequences of harassment would be. After that, we see. I want to speak to him, Edith said. Jasper looked at her carefully. Are you certain? I have been certain of very few things in my life, she said, but I am certain of this. I spent 4 years being afraid of him and managing around him and running from him. I do not want to run any more. He held her gaze. I will be there, he said. Not to speak for you, only to be there. That is exactly what I want, she said. Harold Dawes had, in fact, already intercepted Clifton Price at the door of the Red Lantern, and had moved the conversation to the sheriff's office, which was a small and not particularly comfortable room with a desk and 2 chairs, and a territorial seal on the wall that Harold found useful in establishing the tone of official conversations. Clifton Price was in one of the chairs looking like a man who was not accustomed to being in chairs that other people had assigned him when Edith and Jasper arrived. He saw Edith and his expression went through several things very quickly. Edith, he said. Mr. Price, she said. Her voice was level. He looked at Jasper. Something moved in his face. Who is this? A friend, Edith said. Who is here with my invitation and at my request? Clifton stood up. Harold Dawes did not move from his position near the desk, but he became very attentive. You owe me an explanation, Clifton said to Edith. You left without I left, Edith said clearly, because I had every right to leave. I was not your wife, Mr. Price. I was not your property. I was an employee in your household, and I gave notice by my absence, which I acknowledge was irregular but which I maintain was my right. Clifton's face went dark. There are obligations. There are not, she said. There are none. I have spoken with Sheriff Dawes, and the Territorial Marshal's office has a record of this situation. You have come a long way to hear this, and I am sorry for the journey, but it does not change anything. I live here. I have a position here. I have a community here. You have no claim on me, legal or otherwise, and if you attempt to make one, you will find the territorial authorities are prepared to respond to it. The room was very quiet. Clifton looked at Jasper again. Whatever he read in Jasper's face, in the quality of his stillness, was enough information. He looked back at Edith. He looked at her for a long time, and she thought she saw, somewhere under the anger, the particular bafflement of a man who has never considered that a thing he reached for might not be available to him. It did not make her feel sorry for him, but it clarified something. You could have handled this differently, he said at last, which was the only thing he had left to say. I handled it the only way that was available to me, she said. I wish you a safe journey home. He left Calico Bluff before dark. Harold Dawes confirmed it personally, watching the road from his office window until the hired horse was long gone, and then he came to tell Edith, who was back at the schoolhouse finishing the day with her students, as though the morning had been ordinary. That evening, Edith sat with Jasper on the step outside the post office, their old place, and the winter stars were as enormous as ever, and Thomas was inside asleep because Ruth Benson had kept him all day and worn him thoroughly out with what she described as vigorous indoor activities. It is done, Edith said. It is done, Jasper said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was the first time she had done anything of the kind, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there in the cold January dark watching Calico Bluff breathe slowly around them. I feel like I have been holding something for a very long time, she said, and I have only just now been able to put it down. What does it feel like? He asked. She thought about it. Like my own weight, she said. For the first time in a long time, I can feel my own weight, and it is not as much as I thought it was. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, gentle and certain, and she closed her eyes. Spring came again, the second spring, and Calico Bluff was a different place than it had been the spring before, or perhaps Edith was a different person in it. Probably both. The desert bloomed with things she had not expected it to bloom with, small bright flowers in the red dirt, and the long sage-covered flats gone briefly extravagant with color. And she walked out to the fence line of the Double D on a Sunday afternoon in April, while Thomas ran ahead of her with the focused energy of a nearly 6-year-old, who has decided that running is the appropriate response to good weather. Jasper was waiting at the gate, which he sometimes did on Sundays, and Thomas reached him first and received the kind of greeting that Jasper gave children, which was direct and respectful and did not condescend. The three of them walked the south pasture, which Edith had come to know as well as she knew the inside of the schoolhouse, and Thomas asked about the cattle and Jasper answered patiently and completely. And at some point Thomas ran off to examine something he had spotted in the grass, and Jasper and Edith walked slower, side by side. He had been building towards something. She could feel it in the way certain conversations had been landing in the past few weeks, careful and present and leaning toward a question. He stopped walking. She stopped. He reached into his coat pocket and she saw the smooth river stone that Thomas had given him in October, the one that had been in his pocket this whole time, and alongside it he held something else, a ring, small and plain and gold, which had the look of something old and held onto. "This was Cecilia's," he said. "She would not mind my using it again. She was practical in that way." He looked at Edith steadily. "I am asking you to marry me, Edith. Not because the territory needs a rancher's wife or because Thomas needs a father, though I intend to be both those things faithfully if you will have me. I am asking because you are the most honest and courageous person I have met in my life, and I would like to spend the rest of it with you." She looked at the ring and at his face and at the south pasture of the Double D spreading out behind him in the April light. "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "Jasper, yes." He put the ring on her finger and then he held her hand for a moment, looking at it, and then he looked up at her and she thought he might say something else, but instead he kissed her, there in the April pasture with the sage smell and the distant sound of Thomas investigating whatever he had found in the grass, and it was the kind of kiss that has been building for months and tastes like relief and arrival. "Jasper," Thomas's voice from somewhere to the left. "There is a lizard. Come look." Jasper pulled back and looked at Edith with something that was entirely, unguardedly warm. "We should go look at the lizard," he said. "We should," she agreed, and she was smiling so thoroughly that her face was not entirely sure what to do with it. They were married in June of 1884, in the whitewashed church at the eastern end of Main Street, with Ellen Forsythe looking pleased and Harold Dawes in the front row, and me from the Red Lantern crying in an extremely practical way, dabbing at her eyes between helping carry things. Agnes Peck made the wedding cake. Herbert Peck contributed cider again, this time without any negotiation being required. Elias Crane read a passage from something that was not quite the Bible, but was appropriately solemn. Luther Kane, the blacksmith, played fiddle at the celebration afterward with unexpected grace. Thomas stood at Jasper's side through the ceremony with the seriousness of someone who understood that this was a day that would be counted among important days, and when the minister asked if there was any reason this union should not take place, Thomas, who Edith was fairly certain had been told beforehand not to speak during that part, said in a clear voice, "There is not," which made the whole church laugh in the warm, communal way of people who love the people involved. Edith looked at Jasper when the laughter settled, and he was looking at her with those Creekwater eyes, and she thought of a March morning in 1883, with red dust rising around her feet, and a secret pressed into her chest, and a life that felt too small and too uncertain to hold what she needed it to hold. The minister said, "I pronounce you husband and wife," and Jasper kissed her in front of the whole of Calico Bluff with characteristic attention, not showy but entire, and the whole of Calico Bluff responded with appropriate enthusiasm. Thomas tugged Jasper's sleeve afterward and said, "Does this mean I live at the ranch now?" "Yes," Jasper said, "with the horses, with the horses." Thomas absorbed this with the expression of a person who has received information that exceeded even optimistic projections, and then he walked out of the church ahead of everyone with the proprietary air of a boy who has decided that a ranch is an entirely reasonable inheritance. The Double D was different with a family in it. Edith had not known until she arrived there as Jasper's wife that the ranch house had been quiet in the particular way of houses that have been lived in by only one person for a long time, a quality of held breath, of space that had contracted around its single occupant. Thomas changed that within 2 days of moving in, his belongings appearing in corners and his questions filling the main room and his footsteps going back and forth across the wooden floors, with the dedicated energy of a boy exploring a new world. And Edith changed it too, more slowly, but in ways that were equally real. A different rhythm in the kitchen, books on the shelf that had not been there before, curtains in the bedroom that had been her own practical addition, the sound of her and Jasper talking in the evenings after Thomas was asleep, low-voiced and easy, about the school and the ranch and the town, and all the ordinary miraculous details of shared life. Eli, the young cowhand who had worked for Jasper for 2 years, treated Edith with a respectful friendliness and called her Mrs. Donnelly, with such enthusiasm that she had to remind him twice that Edith was fine. The other 2 hands, brothers named Sam and Frank Ortega, who had been with the Double D since before Jasper bought the land, were quieter about it but equally decent, and Sam had fixed the latch on the kitchen door without being asked on his second day of knowing she was there, which reminded her of Jasper's habit of fixing things silently. The school year that fall was the 3rd she had taught in Calico Bluff, and it was the first in which she was Edith Donnelly on the record, though she was still Miss Hawthorne to most of the students because teachers, in her experience, retained the name they arrived with regardless of what happened next. Patrick Hale was in his final year with her, 14 and now genuinely tall, and she had written a letter on his behalf to a school in Albuquerque that offered secondary education, because she believed he would go somewhere with his particular kind of intelligence if someone pointed him toward the door. His father had come to see her about it, a weathered cattleman named Dale Hale who looked like he had mixed feelings about the whole enterprise, and she had spoken to him plainly and with respect, and at the end he had said, "If Patrick wants it, I won't be the one to stop him." Patrick had wanted it decidedly. The autumn deepened, and the days shortened, and Edith and Jasper moved through the particulars of their new life with a steady pleasure that was not without its difficulties, because no life is, but which had at its center something sound. She told him on a Thursday evening in November, sitting at the kitchen table after supper while Thomas was asleep, that she thought there was going to be another person. Jasper was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression so open and so careful that she felt it land somewhere central. "Are you all right?" he asked first, which was exactly right. "I am well," she said. "Better than well. I only wanted you to know." He got up from his chair and came around the table and sat beside her and took both her hands in his, and he said, "I am very happy," in a voice that made it clear the words were approximately a tenth of what he meant, the way the visible part of something deep is always smaller than what is beneath. She leaned into him. "So am I," she said, "thoroughly, completely happy." They told Thomas the next morning over breakfast. He received the information with the seriousness he gave all important announcements, and then asked 3 questions in rapid succession. Would it be a boy or a girl? How long would it take? And would it be allowed to touch his rock collection? "We do not know yet on the first question," Edith said. "About 8 months on the second, and you will need to make that determination yourself on the third." Thomas considered this. "I will put the good ones up high," he said. Ruth Benson, when told, wept immediately and asked if she could help in any way, and was immediately offered the informal title of honorary grandmother, which she accepted with dignified emotion. Me at the Red Lantern ordered a round of coffee for everyone in the establishment at the time of hearing, which was 4 people, one of whom was Harold Dawes, who raised his cup with the solemn approval of a man acknowledging a satisfactory development. The winter was the mild kind that the territory sometimes produced, cold at night but clear and bright in the days, and Edith taught through December and into January, and when she needed to stop teaching for a period in February, The town council hired a temporary instructor named Mr. Aldous Webb from Santa Fe, who was competent but lacked Edith's quality of genuine interest in whether the children were actually learning. And the children felt this difference and were measurably more difficult for him, which Edith heard about secondhand and did not entirely mind. The baby came in the spring of 1885, which seemed right to her, the territory blooming again and the sky doing its particular extravagance of blue, and the baby was a boy. Jasper held him in the bedroom of the ranch house with the careful attentiveness of a man who does not take fragile things lightly, and he looked at the baby's face for a long time without speaking. "What are you thinking?" Edith asked, from where she lay against the pillow, tired in the bone-deep satisfying way. "I am thinking that some things exceed what you can prepare for," he said, "even when you know they are coming." They named him William James Donnelly, William for Jasper's father who had died 3 years ago in Colorado, James for no particular historical reason, except that it sat well next to William, and they both agreed on it without much discussion, which seemed like a good omen. Thomas received William with the studied magnanimity of a boy who has been preparing to be an older brother for several months, and considers it a responsibility. He showed William his rock collection from a respectful distance and informed William, who was 4 days old and unable to process this information, that the good rocks were on the high shelf and were not to be touched, but that the ones on the low shelf were available for examination once the proper age was reached. William James Donnelly appeared to sleep through this policy briefing, which Thomas accepted philosophically. Edith returned to the schoolhouse in September of 1885, when William was 5 months old and firmly in the care of Ruth Benson for the school hours. Thomas had started school that year as a student rather than an observer, sitting in the front row with his reader open before the other children had even settled, and Edith had made very sure to treat him with exactly the same attention and expectation she gave all her students, no more and no less, and he had responded to this by deciding to be demonstrably excellent, which she thought was a reasonable outcome. The letters from Clara came regularly, full of George's railroad news and reports of Abilene and the slow, ordinary progress of their lives, and every letter ended with Clara saying that she hoped they were well, and that she loved Edith and was glad she was happy, and underneath that a line that was usually something like, "I always knew you would figure it out," which was generous because there had been stretches of time when neither of them had been certain of any such thing. Walter Greer continued to be the kind of man he was, making periodic attempts to dispute things that did not belong to him, but the county records and Harold Dawes' straightforward willingness to document everything made these attempts expensive and ultimately unsuccessful, and after the third one failed, he seemed to reduce the frequency, if not the genuine grievance. Calico Bluff had an equilibrium that did not require everyone in it to be pleasant, only to be approximately contained. Patrick Hale went to the school in Albuquerque in the fall of 1885 and wrote back the following spring with an enormous description of what it was like to see the Rio Grande up close for the first time, and Edith read the letter at her school desk and felt the particular pride of a teacher who has watched a door open for someone. She wrote him back and told him to write often and to keep going. The Double D grew in the year that followed. Jasper added a section to the south pasture and brought in another 20 head, and the Ortega brothers negotiated a raise that Jasper gave them without a particularly long argument because they were worth it and he knew it. Eli, the youngest hand, got married to a girl from the east side of town named Hannah, and the wedding was small and cheerful, and Thomas ate 3 pieces of wedding cake on the grounds that he was 7 now and had earned the right to make decisions about cake. William had begun to walk and to form opinions about things. His opinions were fewer than Thomas's but delivered with greater volume, and the ranch house was loud in the good way, the way houses are when they have been claimed entirely by living. Edith sat on the porch one evening in the summer of 1886, William asleep inside, and Thomas doing something educational with a lamp, and a map that she had decided not to investigate too closely, and Jasper beside her in the porch chairs they had acquired from a family moving through who needed to lighten their wagon, and the desert going through its evening performance of color and stillness. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "When I stepped off the stagecoach in Calico Bluff," she said, "I told myself this town would do, that it was adequate. That adequate was enough to work with." She looked out at the distance. "I was wrong about what I was actually choosing. I thought I was choosing a refuge, something to hide in while I rebuilt." "But," he said. "But it was not that," she said. "Or it was at first and then it became something else. It became a life, a real one, not the shape of one." She turned to look at him. "I have never said that plainly, that I am grateful not just for safety, not just for the practical architecture of what I managed to build, but for the life itself, for this specific life." He reached over and took her hand. "I know," he said, "I have known." "I wanted to say it plainly," she said. "Then it is plainly received," he said, and squeezed her hand once and held it. The stars came out over New Mexico the way they always did, with a thoroughness that never became ordinary, and the desert cooled. And somewhere inside the house, Thomas said something authoritative to himself about geography, and William shifted in whatever dream he was in, and Jasper Donnelly and Edith Donnelly sat in their porch chairs on the Double D, and let the evening come down around them like something deserved. Clara and George came to visit in the autumn of 1887, which Clara had been threatening for 2 years and had finally managed, taking the train to Santa Fe and then the stage to Calico Bluff. Clara was 40 and had George's gray beginning at her temples and the look of a woman who has made peace with her particular life, and when she stepped off the stage and saw Edith, they held each other in the street for long enough that the stagecoach driver waited with patient tact. "You look well," Clara said, pulling back to look at her. "You look genuinely well, not the managed kind." "I am genuinely well," Edith said. Clara looked past her to where Jasper was standing on the boardwalk with William on his hip and Thomas beside him, and she observed them for a moment with the particular attention of a sister who has been waiting to make this assessment for some time. Then she looked back at Edith. "All right," she said. "Yes, I see." "You see what?" Edith asked. "Everything I needed to see," Clara said, and took her hand and walked toward them. George shook Jasper's hand with the warmth of a man who has been told good things and is glad to confirm them in person. And Thomas subjected Clara to an account of everything that had happened in Calico Bluff since March of 1883 that was thorough enough to last most of the walk back to the ranch house. And William fell asleep against Jasper's shoulder with the absolute confidence of a child who has never questioned his security. They stayed 2 weeks, and those 2 weeks were full of long evenings on the porch and good meals and stories that unrolled slowly through the warm autumn nights. Clara and Edith picking up threads of conversation that had been carried in letters, and expanding them into the fuller thing that presence makes possible. George and Jasper discovered a mutual interest in land policy and territorial governance that sustained them through several long afternoons, and Thomas followed George around with the fixed attention of a boy who has decided that a railroad man is an excellent primary source on a number of subjects. On the last evening, Clara and Edith sat alone on the porch after the others had gone inside, and Clara said, "Are you happy, Edith? Really?" "Yes," Edith said without hesitation. Not just managing, Edith said. "Not performing it, not maintaining it, actually genuinely in the bones happy." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good. I worried for a long time. I knew you would survive it, you were always going to survive it. But surviving and living are different things, and I was not certain when you left that you believed you were allowed to have the second one." Edith looked out at the dark and thought about that for a moment. "I was not certain," she said, "for a while. And then I was in this place and I met these people and I taught these children, and one particular man sat down next to me on a step under the stars and asked me to tell him all of it." She paused, "and I told him all of it, and it did not end me." Clara reached over and put her hand over Edith's on the porch rail. "No," she said softly, It did not. They listened to the desert breathe. "I will be back in 2 years," Clara said. "And I expect there to be at least one more person to account for by then." "Clara," Edith said. "I am simply noting the pattern," Clara said, with a composure that Edith knew perfectly well was entirely deliberate. Edith laughed, which was the right thing to do, and the laughter went up into the dark New Mexico night and dissolved into the stars. Thomas Hawthorne, who went by Thomas Donnelly at school, and had decided at age 8 that the question of which name he used was his own business, and he would use both as the occasion demanded, wrote his first complete essay in October of 1887 on the subject of the Rio Grande River, which he had never seen but intended to. His teacher, who was also his mother and tried hard to grade him neither more leniently nor more harshly than anyone else, gave him a red mark of commendation on the top of the page, and told him the essay was excellent and that his research was thorough. Thomas received this assessment with dignity. Then he went home and told Jasper he had gotten a commendation, the formal word, and Jasper told him he had earned it and that celebrating things you worked for was appropriate. They celebrated with pie from me, who had added a proper bakery section to the Red Lantern and was deeply satisfied with this development, and Thomas considered the pie an appropriate recognition of his geographical scholarship. By 1888, Calico Bluff had grown to just over 400 people, which meant a second schoolteacher was discussed, and Edith sat on the committee that hired a young woman from Las Cruces named Alice Morno, who was 23, and had the kind of quiet fire about teaching that Edith recognized as the real thing. She sat with Alice through her first week and showed her the rhythms of the school and told her the things that the job description could not contain, which students needed more patience and which needed more challenge, where the drafts came through in the winter, how to handle Patrick Hale's younger brother, who was 10 and had even stronger opinions about geography than his brother had. She told Alice one afternoon about arriving in Calico Bluff in 1883 and what the first weeks had been like, and Alice listened with the attention of someone taking useful notes. "You were alone when you came," Alice said. "I was," Edith said. "Was it frightening?" Edith thought about the red dust rising around her feet and the weight of the secret she had been carrying and the narrow bed above the post office and the way she had pressed her hand flat against her chest and told herself to breathe. "Yes," she said, "but the frightening part was not the town. The town turned out to be something I had not expected." "What had you expected?" "Adequate," Edith said. "I had expected adequate," Alice smiled. "And it was more than that." "It was considerably more than that," Edith agreed. The second baby, Clara and George Marsh's prediction notwithstanding, did not arrive until the spring of 1889, which was beyond their 2-year window but only just. And when she arrived she was a girl, small and certain of herself in the particular way of people who intend to be heard, and they named her Rose Margaret Donnelly. Rose because Edith had always loved the word and Margaret for Jasper's mother, who was alive in Colorado and cried when they wrote to tell her. Thomas's response to a sister was different from his response to William. He had approached William with policy and supervision. He approached Rose with a kind of bewildered tenderness that he did not entirely know what to do with, and which expressed itself primarily through sitting near her and reporting on her activities to Jasper as though he were filing dispatches from a foreign country. "She looked at me," he told Jasper at breakfast, 3 days after Rose came home, "for a long time, just directly at me." "Babies do that," Jasper said. "I know," Thomas said, "but she did it like she knew something." "What do you think she knew?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I think she knew I was her brother," he said, with the seriousness he had never grown out of and which Edith suspected he never would. Jasper looked at him with those creekwater eyes. "I think you are probably right," he said. The 1880s closed and the 1890s opened, and Calico Bluff continued its steady life, growing and changing in the gradual way of territory towns that have found their footing, and the Donnelly family grew with it in the particular way of families that are alive to what matters. Edith taught at the Calico Bluff School until 1893, when the school had grown large enough to require 3 teachers and Alice Morno had grown confident enough to become the senior educator. And Edith stepped back to a part-time role that let her be at the ranch more during the years when Thomas was finishing school, and William was in his difficult middle years, and Rose was beginning to read with the focused intensity of a person who has decided that books are a primary relationship. Thomas went to Albuquerque in 1892 to the secondary school, following the trail that Patrick Hale had made, and he wrote letters that were long and detailed and full of geography, and came home for summers to work beside Jasper on the ranch with a wholehearted willingness that had grown from his first assessment at the livery stable fence. He was not going to be a rancher, ultimately. He wanted to be a surveyor of all things, which made Jasper laugh in a way that was pure and genuine, given the boundary dispute that had been one of the first things Edith had ever known about him. "Then you will be the best surveyor in the territory," Jasper told him, and meant it completely. William grew into someone quieter than Thomas and louder than expected, if that makes sense. A boy who expressed himself in action rather than words, but whose actions were large and emphatic. He was, by 12, the best rider in his age bracket in the county, a fact that Jasper noted without excessive pride, and with the steady encouragement of a man who knows that specific excellence in a young person should be respected rather than redirected. Rose read everything. She read the McGuffey readers, and then the books from Agnes Peck's lending library, and then, by the time she was 7, had begun a correspondence with a teacher at the Albuquerque school who sent her additional books on a rotating basis, because Alice Morno had identified her as someone who needed more than the schoolhouse could reasonably provide. Edith watched this with a full and complicated heart, the feeling of seeing something of yourself in someone who came from you and is also entirely their own. The years moved the way good years do, not slowly, but with enough substance in them that you can look back and find them full. Jasper's hair went gray at the temples by 1894, which suited him in the way that gray suited certain men who had always had that quality of weight in them. Edith cut hers differently in the fashion of the decade, shorter and with less ceremony, and Jasper told her she looked like herself, which was the best thing she could have heard him say. They had an argument once, a real one, about whether to take a loan against the ranch to expand the herd during a period when cattle prices were strong, and the argument lasted 3 days and was conducted with the candor of 2 people who had learned years ago that honesty between them was more valuable than smoothness. She thought the loan was too much risk. He thought the opportunity was worth it. They spoke about it thoroughly, including at the supper table where Thomas, who was visiting, provided an unsolicited survey of the economic literature on territorial cattle expansion. And in the end, they made a compromise that was smaller than Jasper had wanted and larger than Edith had originally proposed, and it worked out about as well as the compromise warranted. Not as well as the large bet would have, not as badly as the most cautious option might have, but solidly and without disaster. They were both, afterward, slightly smug about having been right, which they acknowledged to each other with the mutual amusement of people who have agreed to be honest even when it is funny. Harold Dawes retired as sheriff in 1895 and moved to Santa Fe to be near a daughter there, and Calico Bluff gave him a farewell at the Red Lantern that lasted until well past midnight and included speeches by Elias Crane and me, and unexpectedly, William Donnelly at 14, who had never been particularly verbal but who said, with great simplicity, that Harold Dawes was the kind of man who made a place safe without making it small. And that was the hardest kind of work there was. There was a silence after William said that, and then a great deal of noise, and Harold Dawes, who had been wearing the controlled expression of a man managing his feelings since about 6 in the evening, stopped managing them. Calico Bluff in 1896 was not the same town that had received a dusty woman with a carpetbag and a secret in March of 1883, and yet it was recognizably itself. The general store still ran by the Peck family, now with their son Daniel in charge, Agnes having retired to her quilting and her library. The blacksmith changed hands when Luther Kane got too old for the hammer, and his apprentice, a young man named Tors, took over with considerably more energy. The Red Lantern had become genuinely respectable, a situation that me regarded with the mixed feelings of a woman who had built a reputation on not being entirely respectable and was not certain she approved of the change. The school was now 4 teachers and nearly 60 students, and the building had been expanded twice, the second time with lumber contributed partly by the Double D, which Jasper had organized without any announcement, and which Edith had found out about 3 weeks later from Elias Crane's replacement at the post office, and which she had confronted Jasper about at supper. "You donated lumber to the school," she said. "The school needed a new room," he said. "You did not mention it." "It did not need mentioning," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the full, deep affection of someone who has been knowing a person for 13 years and is still finding things to add to the catalog. "You have been fixing things without telling me since the day I arrived," she said. "I have," he agreed. "You fixed the schoolhouse step," she said, "in the summer of 1883, before we had even had a conversation." "I noticed it needed fixing," he said. "Jasper," she said. He looked at her. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said. "I love you too." Said without performance, the way entirely true things are said when you have been saying them long enough that they have settled into their permanent shape. Thomas came home from Albuquerque in 1897, certified surveyor, 22 years old, and carrying himself with the easy confidence of a young man who has become what he intended to become. He spent the summer at the Double D, and then took a position with the Territorial Surveyor's Office and moved to Santa Fe, from which he wrote letters with the same careful detail and geographical enthusiasm he had always applied to correspondence. He came home for Christmas that year with a young woman named Dolores Vega, who was from a Santa Fe family and who had the directness and warmth of someone Thomas would inevitably choose, and who looked at the Double D and at Calico Bluff, and at the way Jasper and Edith moved through their life together, and said, during a walk with Edith the second day, "He told me about you, about what you built here. He is very proud." Edith thought about a 4-year-old boy at Clara's gate saying, "You are coming back," and about the weight she had been carrying on a stagecoach in spring. "We built it together," she said, "all of us." Dolores looked at her with dark eyes that were kind and clear. "Yes," she said, "but you started it." Thomas and Dolores married the following year in Santa Fe, and Edith and Jasper went up for the wedding and danced together at the reception in the way of people who have been dancing together for years and no longer need to think about it, which is to say with complete ease and some pleasure. And Thomas watched them from across the room, and Dolores put her hand in his, and he held it and said nothing, and did not need to. Rose, at 9, attended the wedding and came back with 17 questions about Santa Fe that she distributed across the following week. William, at 14, attended the wedding and came back saying nothing specific, but with the look of a young man who had noticed certain things. The century turned on January 1, 1900, and Calico Bluff marked it with a gathering in the street, lanterns strung between the buildings, which had doubled since 1883, and Me's Bakery providing an extraordinary amount of cake. It was cold, the territory doing what it sometimes did in January, going sharp and bright and almost lunar in its clarity, and Edith stood with Jasper's arm around her, and Rose against her side, and William slightly apart in the way of 15-year-old boys who are not going to stand right next to their mothers at a public event, but who are also not going to wander far. And she looked at the lit street and the gathered faces of people she had known for 17 years. She thought of the advertisement in the St. Louis newspaper, a woman of good character and some schooling to serve as schoolteacher in Calico Bluff, New Mexico Territory, wages modest but fair. She had come here with a secret that she had expected to be disqualifying. She had come expecting to be managed and contained and tolerated at best. She had come not knowing that the territory had its own terms for what a person could be, and that a particular man who came to town on Tuesdays would sit down next to her and ask to hear all of it. Jasper felt her look up at him and looked down. "What are you thinking?" he asked, which was a question that in 17 years had never grown stale between them. "About a stagecoach," she said, "and red dust, and a terrible first opinion of this town." "You told me it would do," he said. "I told you that." "You told me that in October of 1883, he said, "sitting on the fence of my south pasture. You said you had arrived thinking it would do, and you had been wrong about what you were actually choosing. You remembered that." "I remember most things you say," he said, which was, after 17 years, no longer a surprise but was still something, the way certain reliable things remain something even after they have stopped being unexpected. She pressed closer to his side and looked back at the lit street. The fiddle started somewhere in the crowd, the same kind of sound it had always been in the Red Lantern on ordinary evenings, reedy and warm and particular to this place, and someone began to dance, and then someone else, and Calico Bluff welcomed its new century the way it had weathered everything else. Together in the cold and the light, with enough warmth between its people to make the darkness beside the point. Rose tugged Edith's hand. "Dance with me, Mama." Edith looked down at her daughter, who had her gray eyes and Jasper's stubbornness and her own particular quality of wanting everything to be understood fully, and she thought, "Here is the thing about the life you build in the dark out of the materials available to you. You do not know when you are building it what it is going to be. You only know what you are doing and why, and you keep doing it. And one day you look up and the thing you have built is not a shelter. It is not a hiding place. It is not a careful architecture of escape. It is a life. A real one in the bones, with red dust and creekwater eyes, and a boy who always knew his brother would look at him, and a girl who reads everything, and a son who surveys the ground that needs to be mapped, and a man who fixes things without announcing it, and holds your hand in the cold dark of the years turning with everything between you settled and true." "Yes," Edith Donnelly said to her daughter, "dance with me." And they danced, all of them in the first light of the new century, in the town that had done more than do, in the life that had been more than enough.